Good afternoon. My name is Lindsey Brown, and I currently work as an administrator in the Rochester City School District in upstate New York. I'm not here representing my institution, but my work in over 20 years of education really frames my perspective on this topic. So my talk is entitled Open Secrets, Inaccessible Texts as a Roadmap to Mobbing. So we're going to talk about what is the hidden narratives, how do hidden narratives impact this problem, and what are some things that we can do individually and as a group to protect from, to create a more trauma-informed approach to workplace conflict. So what are the foundational conditions where mobbing can happen? In my kind of cursory look at the research and then my life experience, I think some institutional conditions make mobbing a greater possibility. I work in a unionized setting, right? Or if you work in the public sector, that's a very different kind of culture. And I think while a union offers protections, it can also create conditions that sometimes exacerbate mobbing. So there's like structures of advancement that are very fixed, right? It's difficult to remove somebody from the system. There's the newcomer status is a very big deal if you work in a public sector or unionized sector. And then also because of your union protections, institutionally sanctioned demotion is more common. So I think because of these protections, sometimes there's special considerations that are, while these protections are protective, it changes the tenor of an organization. I also work in education, which is a pink-collar profession, and there's been some research around similarly gendered professions amplifying potential mobbing. Destabilized leadership, when there's leadership churn, right? If you're resource poor and you have insufficient support, welcome to public education, especially urban public education. And then if you have a specialized skill set, right, where you don't have a lot of mobility, right, that can sometimes lead to sort of like this, you're all together, you're not going to move around, and you sort of turn on each other. For the individual, what can make an individual more vulnerable to mobbing? Is it somebody who's a whistleblower, right? Have they said, oh, this isn't right within the organization? Are they differently able, right? Do they have a non-normative race, religion, ethnicity, or sexual orientation relative to the organization, right? Do they produce too much or produce too little, or do they not adhere to the implicit contractual expectations? So implicit contractual expectations is kind of an oxymoron, right? But if you work in a unionized setting, here's the contract. The contract sets out what you do, right? But then there's those implicit expectations of working to the contract or not working beyond the contract or all those things. Those are very subtle things that in the public sector are really real. If somebody has their institutional role as very sacred to their identity, right, I think that can also really make them more emotionally vulnerable to the impact of mobbing, if not necessarily the actual thing. And then previous trauma, personal trauma, right, secondary trauma from a high-stress job, right? I was really impacted with a previous teacher or a previous presenter announcing those like police, prison workers, paramedics, right? So when you're in a system that has rife with trauma and there's a lot of secondary trauma, I think this is probably more likely to occur. I want us to consider some inaccessible texts, right? Or how inaccessible texts in terms of employment might impact us and how we move, how our HR departments move, how we move as teams, how we move as leaders, right? Because a question I'm really interested in is how can a leader protect their team from this occurring, right? So you have your resume, that's your explicit, accessible text, right? But within the resume, what do you do when you pick up a resume? You look for gaps. You look for lateral moves. You look for different weird timing, right? That's a hidden text around this, right? Formal evaluations, those are shared, those are open, right? Often there will be a space for an employee to respond. Hey, this is my point of view, right? I consider that a hidden text because you're not collaboratively constructing the evaluation. And I'm not suggesting that you should, but I just want us to think about how explicit and implicit play off each other here. Personnel file, here's your official personnel file, shadow personnel file, right? What your HR department knows and says about you, all of those different things, right? How they will use like improvement plans or informal improvement plans, right? Those things are, you know, once you're seasoned in an institution, you become more aware of those things, right? Public board meetings, again, I work in a public school district, so it's all there for you to see on tape, right? But then whenever they speak about personnel, it's going to be an executive session. Again, I'm not saying there shouldn't be executive session, but I'm saying that's an example of a hidden text, right? And then, hey, you have a resignation letter. Maybe you share that letter with your team. Maybe you share that letter publicly. Maybe you just share that letter with HR, right? And then you have your HR meeting about, hey, I'm making a professional transition, and we're having the conversation, right? So what is seen, what is public, and what is hidden? If we look at Sperry's model around communication as mobbing progresses, right? So I is individual, O is organization, G is the group, and then victim comes in, right? So if you look in the second, this is kind of the progression of healthy to severely mobbed, right? And if you look, even in the very first visual, the victim loses two-way communication. They don't get to speak back, right? They lose control of the narrative, and it progressively becomes worse, right? What happens if you speak? Right? So there's a psychologist, Jennifer Freed, whose work I adore, right? And again, like I say, I come at this from a trauma-informed lens because that's what I do every day with students, families, and my team, right? But according to her model, right, if a victim or somebody who is impacted speaks, the system will often respond in this way with a deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, right? How do you scapegoat the person, right? Everything is always more complex. Everybody wears all roles in these interactions, right? But whoever has the institutional power often dictates, right, whether this is allowed or not. That can lead to the large category of institutional betrayal, right? I'm here at this institution, right? I have moral injury because what the institution states its mission is not what I see or what's occurring, right? The institution has a failure to prevent abuse, punishes victims and whistleblowers, dismisses victims' experience, can inadequately respond to abuse, and then cover up bad acts to save the reputation, right? This is when it goes wrong. This is not all institutions all the time, right? But it's something to be really cognizant of. It's shown that, right, when you have institutional betrayal, that makes the traumatic, impact of mobbing worse. In fact, I would posit that sometimes people who are victims of mobbing or come through with trauma are suffering from something called betrayal blindness, where they may hide this even to themselves, right? So, the more dependent, the research of Jennifer Freed has really said the more dependent that somebody is on somebody who transgresses against them, right? An abuser or an institution, right? The more dependent you are, the more likely that you are to use protective denial, right? And so I would posit that betrayal blindness plays a large role, right? And also, even if you're not blind, what you speak and what you say and how you can be, right, becomes adaptive because you know what the consequences are going to be. So again, my journey, I have the wonderful, wonderful privilege of serving students and families in one of the big 5 urban school districts in New York State. I've served in a number of different roles, right, in building leadership, right, and then you're running a team. So as I said before, my main goal as a leader, as I'm looking around, is to assist my team, my teachers and my team with secondary trauma, right? Because public schools, particularly rural, impoverished schools, and schools in high concentrations of poverty, they're downhill of all of these social issues, and you're supposed to solve it, right? And they're also built around metrics that aren't always human-centered, right? Test scores are not human-centered. They're not. Right? It is very difficult to find a good human-centered metric that is going to imbue holistic humanity into a system. That's very difficult, right? So we rely on these inadequate metrics. So as a leader and as a professional, my job, is to say, how can I get my team to work together? How can I prevent them from turning on each other? How can I interrupt the pass the hot potato culture of like, not my problem in a large bureaucracy? What do I do? What can I do to do that? And if I can do that with my team, then my teachers are going to do it with my students, and my students are going to do it with each other, and my teachers are going to be able to communicate with across the table with families and support, like create a team of support around a child, right? So this is very critical work, because if the teaching team is consuming itself, right, with this, mobbing behaviors or aggressive behaviors or passing along around this trauma instead of interrupting it, then we're not being effective, right? So Jennifer Freed also identifies something called institutional courage, right? And the definition is there on the slide, right? Engage in moral action despite unpleasantness, risk, and short-term cost to protect and care for those who depend on the institution. So those who are served by the institution depend on the institution, and those who work within the institution depend on the institution, right? How can we all be protected? Right? What is our vision for that? And I'm a really on-the-ground person, right? Like, what can I do tomorrow with my teachers, with my team, to make this different? I think the movement toward restorative practices is very powerful. So restorative community building means that if I create a relationship with you first, and we have a relationship as a relationship, and I invest time and space to that as a leader, then that prevents me from turning on you. That prevents me from scapegoating you. That prevents me from being unable to listen to your story, right? Also, if we're talking about burnout prevention, how can we have, we love to put the burnout prevention back on the person. Oh, do self-care. Oh, it's another thing I have to do after I go home with my kids, and then I go, okay. What about using psychological paradigms like DBT skills, which are really, they're like meditation, right? Like they're human-centered skills, and we're empowering our employees with those skills so that they can interrupt trauma, so they can create oases of flourishing within themselves and in their teams. Trauma-informed incident debriefs, as I talked before about, like if you have a high degree of saturated trauma or you're a trauma interrupter, right? You work in an emergency room. Like, in my job, you have a very difficult scenario. You go, it's an emergency. You have to interrupt. You have to recreate safety. There's no space for me to debrief that, right? What if we created intentional spaces for people to come out of those situations, debrief, and ensure that they're okay, so that this secondary trauma doesn't occur? Grief circles, right? If something happens, if there's a change in the community, how do we talk to each other about it? How do we hold each other's grief? And I talked before about, right, human-centered metrics, and they're difficult, right? But when we have institutions that are driven by profit motives, or they're driven by, if you're looking and you're in a college and it's where's your U.S. News and World Report ranking based on these, non-human-centered metrics, then it takes the humanity out of the whole institution. And then, protective policies and protocols. Again, I'm here from Rochester, I'm American, and I'm listening to people from Australia and Canada talk about their governmental frameworks to prevent mobbing, and I'm like, right, ojalá. I'm a bilingual educator, so that means if only in Spanish, right? If only in the United States we had like labor protections or solidarity or consciousness, right? But I think that it's also easy for us to say, oh, that doesn't exist. Well, clearly it does exist, right? So we need to look at those things and take them seriously and just, right, make that our North Star. And lastly, I'd just like to say that I think building solidarity and consciousness is an iterative work. I think that it takes courage to come and say, I want to be in company with people who are exploring and trying to find a solution to a problem. And, I'm very grateful to be here and very excited about the work that's happening all around us. Thank you so much.